The ballroom sparkled with excess. Crystal chandeliers shimmered like frozen fireworks above a crowd of power suits and couture gowns. Wine flowed like water, laughter pinged off the walls, and the scent of buttered escargot mingled with perfume worth more than a month's rent. It was the annual Lancaster Global Tech Summit dinner, an exclusive event hosted by Vivian Lancaster, a CEO known as much for her billion-dollar company as for her cruel tongue and zero-tolerance attitude toward anything that didn't serve her ego. Vivian sat at the center of the head table, flanked by venture capitalists, ambassadors, and high-ranking executives. She was dressed in crimson satin, a diamond-studded necklace glinting under the chandelier light. She scanned the room like a queen inspecting her court. And that's when she noticed him. A young black waiter, no older than his late 20s, moved gracefully among the tables. Crisp uniform, perfect posture, not hurried, not slow. Every step calculated. His name tag read Miles. He carried himself with an ease that irritated Vivian. There was no submission in his gait, no nervousness. In his eyes, just calm confidence. She watched him pour wine for a diplomat with a soft thank you in French. Her smile tightened. Of course they're hiring poets now, she muttered to the table. Loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to be plausibly deniable. A few of the men laughed, not because it was funny, but because Vivian's approval was expensive. As Miles moved toward the main table, she leaned to her CFO. Look at him. Polished like he's about to pitch a startup. I bet he thinks he's smarter than half this room. The CFO offered a tight smile. Maybe he is, he said under his breath. Vivian didn't hear him. She was already smirking as Miles approached. When he arrived with the wine, Vivian looked up at him like he was a child at her feet. So, Miles, she said sweetly, like a wolf in silk, tell me something. You ever think of doing something real with that lovely speaking voice of yours? Miles didn't blink. Yes, ma'am. Every day. Vivian raised an eyebrow. The game had begun. The ballroom hummed with casual arrogance, the kind that only billions in net worth and unchecked egos could generate. Conversations were dipped in buzzwords and polished with Ivy League bravado. But at the heart of it all sat Vivian Lancaster, tech mogul, power broker, queen of the room, and tonight she was hungry for a different kind of entertainment. She had locked onto Miles like a predator watching a deer graze too confidently on its turf. It wasn't just his composure that irked her. It was the way he carried dignity, like it belonged to him. That quiet pride, the kind that couldn't be bought or bent, made her skin itch. Miles moved with grace, his tray steady, his smile genuine but controlled. The occasional guest thanked him, some ignored him. He responded to both with equal poise. He paused beside a French diplomat, who asked for a specific bottle in rapid, accented French. Without hesitation, Miles nodded and replied fluently, even slipping in a polite joke that made the diplomat chuckle. Vivian's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward. What was that? The diplomat smiled. He speaks beautifully, he said. Perfect pronunciation. Vivian tilted her head, clearly unimpressed. How charming, she said in a flat tone. A waiter who doubles as a parrot. The guests around her tensed. No one said anything. That was Vivian's favorite kind of silence, complicit and cowardly. Miles continued serving. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes had changed. Not anger, not fear, just a mental note, filed and sealed. Vivian noticed. She wanted a reaction. She wanted the smugness peeled away. And when she didn't get it, she turned theatrical. As Miles approached their table again, Vivian raised her glass high like a toast and said loudly, All right then, you're clearly full of hidden talents. Miles paused, eyebrows raised, slightly. If you're so smart, she said with venom wrapped in velvet, then translate this. Then she snapped out a sentence in rapid-fire Mandarin. It was showy and smug, with a tone that screamed, I bet this will shut him up. Laughter flickered around the table, uncertain but eager to follow her lead. She leaned back in her chair with a victorious smirk, as if she'd just checkmated a child in a game he didn't understand. For a few moments, the air stood still. Miles didn't flinch. He looked her directly in the eye. Then he responded, calm, clear and flawless, in Mandarin. Not only did he translate her sentence perfectly, he corrected a tonal error she'd made. Actually, he said with a respectful nod, still in Mandarin, I believe you meant to say Shang Ye Hui Yi, not Shang Ye Hui Yi Shang De Zhu, unless you intended to call this a business meeting for pigs. A silence fell over the table like a dropped curtain. A few guests blinked. One chuckled awkwardly. Someone near the back gasped. The Chinese diplomat from earlier turned toward Vivienne, visibly stifling a grin. Vivienne blinked once, lips parting as if to speak, but no words arrived. Miles wasn't finished. Without breaking. Stride, he repeated the sentence, in flawless German, then again in crisp, formal Japanese. With each repetition, his voice remained steady, almost gentle, but the power behind his words was undeniable. A quiet, rippling awe spread through the guests like wind through wheat. People began to whisper. Did he just... Wait, how many languages was that? Is this some kind of performance? Vivienne tried to laugh it off, but the sound stuck in her throat. She waved a hand. Fine, you're a human Duolingo. Good for you, but let's not pretend parroting sentences makes you a genius. That's when it shifted. The room, the tension, the balance of power. Because Miles didn't just shrug off her insult, he elevated, above it. My apologies if I came across as performative, he said, now in English, calm and level. I was simply responding to a request. You did, after all, ask me to translate. A few chuckles broke the tension, but Vivienne wasn't laughing. She stared at him, eyes narrowing. What are you exactly? A linguistic circus act working tables for tips? Miles met her gaze, unwavering. No, ma'am. I'm someone who respects every job, especially the ones people assume require no intelligence. There it was. Not anger, not defiance, but an unshakable dignity that cut sharper than any insult. Vivienne leaned back in her chair, eyes on fire. She was about to strike again when another voice entered the conversation, deep, composed, and unmistakably impressed. Actually, the voice said, what you just witnessed wasn't a parlor trick. That was higher-order fluency, real-time cognitive code switching, something very few linguists in the world can pull off. The crowd turned to see the speaker, Dr. Andrew Ling, one of the top developers in global language AI. Vivienne's jaw tightened. Miles simply nodded, then returned to his duties like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The room was frozen in that kind of silence that doesn't happen by accident, where no one even pretends to be casual anymore. Silverware hovered above plates, eyes locked in on either Miles or Vivienne, waiting for someone, anyone, to break the stillness. But Miles didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or swagger or soak in the victory. He simply nodded to the guests who were whispering and carried on, adjusting his tray, back straight, pace measured. That quiet humility, that rattled Vivienne more than anything else. She tried to chuckle, though the sound was brittle, like glass under pressure. Okay, she said with a tight little clap. Impressive. Very National Geographic. A few guests winced. One of the European investors cleared his throat awkwardly. Vivienne noticed and immediately added, Oh, come on, I'm just saying. He's got the ear of a savant. What's the harm in being surprised? She was already trying to pivot, reclaim the narrative, but her words had the sour aftertaste of damage control. And then came the moment no one saw coming. Miles had just finished pouring a glass of wine when a man at the far end of the VIP table stood up. He was tall, elegant, in a dark navy Nehru style jacket, quietly powerful. His hair was salt and pepper, his demeanor regal. People knew his face, but the realization hit in waves. It was Dr. Andrew Ling, co-founder of LinguaCode, one of the world's most advanced language AI firms. More importantly, he was Vivienne Lancaster's most prized prospect. She'd been courting a partnership with him for over a year. Their deal was rumored to be worth over $300 million, and now he was standing because of a waiter. Vivienne froze. Dr. Ling turned toward Miles with genuine curiosity and respect. That was Mandarin, German, and Japanese, correct? He asked. Miles inclined his head. Yes, sir. I speak 9 fluently, conversational in 5 more. Gasps erupted at nearby tables. Dr. Ling smiled. What's your primary field? Miles hesitated, clearly still playing the part. Tonight? Hospitality? Dr. Ling chuckled, then turned to the room. Ladies and gentlemen, you may not know this, but our friend here didn't just translate 3 major world languages on the fly. He also corrected the grammar in the original sentence, which, I might add, is something most native speakers wouldn't catch. Then he looked at Vivian. You asked him to translate. He didn't just translate. He elevated the statement and exposed a linguistic misfire. And he did it with grace. Vivian's face had gone pale, her lipstick now looking absurdly bright against her clenched mouth. She stammered, "Well, I mean, it was just a joke. A test?" Dr. Ling finished, smiling knowingly. Interesting. Because you see, Ms. Lancaster, we also run tests, but ours are meant to discover talent, not diminish it. Whispers rippled. Guests began tapping their phones under the table. It was only a matter of time before the story exploded beyond the ballroom. Vivian's voice faltered. He's just a waiter. Are we really? Dr. Ling raised his hand, gently but firmly. No, he's not just anything. That's the problem with the way you see the world. You think intelligence has a dress code. You think brilliance comes with a title. He looked around the table. Some of the most fluent, brilliant, and perceptive minds I've ever met didn't wear suits. And this young man? He looked back at Miles. He's one of the best I've ever seen in live multilingual parsing. I'd know. He's been working with my lab for the past 6 months. There it was, the bombshell. Vivian's head snapped toward Miles. What? Miles met her eyes, this time with calm clarity. I consult on AI natural language processing and dialect detection, he said simply. Dr. Ling brought me in as a human benchmark. I test the limits of his models against real-time fluency. She began, but the sentence died. He asked to shadow in this environment, Dr. Ling added. He chose hospitality tonight, not because it's beneath him, but because it reveals things, how people treat the invisible, how they behave when no one powerful is watching. The words stung, not just because they were true, but because everyone in the room now knew it. Vivian, in her hunger for control, had revealed her character under pressure. And Miles? He had revealed something else entirely. A guest across the room called out, "So this whole thing, this was a setup?" Dr. Ling shook his head. Not a setup, a mirror. And mirrors never lie. The room fell silent again. Not from fear this time, but from collective reflection. Guests who had smirked earlier now avoided eye contact with Miles. Others looked at him with newfound respect. Vivian had lost control. She could feel it slipping from her grasp like sand. She tried to laugh, tried to grab hold of something, anything, but the words felt heavy. All right, fine. So he's smart, but don't you think this was a little theatrical? She offered. Dr. Ling's smile faded. You mocked him, publicly, repeatedly. You tried to humiliate someone based on the color of their skin and the role they were playing. That's theatrical. That's cruelty dressed up as wit. What he did? That was discipline. And brilliance. Miles, still holding his tray, quietly stepped back. Vivian turned to her remaining guests, desperate for validation. You all know me. You know I would never. But they weren't listening. Some were already rising, others texting under the table. The tide had turned, and it wasn't coming back. And in the quiet space between the collapsing illusion of her authority and the rising applause for a man she had tried to shrink, Vivian Lancaster finally understood. She had misjudged not just a man, but the moment. By the time Miles quietly stepped away from Vivian's table, the ballroom had completely changed. It looked the same. Chandeliers still twinkling, champagne still bubbling, soft piano music still dancing in the background. But the air was different, heavier, sharper. It wasn't just the embarrassment clinging to Vivian anymore. It was awakening in the room itself. People were no longer just guests. They were witnesses. And Vivian Lancaster? She wasn't the host anymore. She was on trial. She watched Miles disappear into the side hallway, still carrying his tray, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. That poise, that self-control, it made her furious. She could feel her cheeks flushing, her carefully applied makeup suddenly too tight on her skin. Her assistant leaned in, whispering, "We should pivot. Maybe pull focus to the investors panel." "No," she snapped. "We control the room. It's not over." But even as she said it, she knew it was. At the side of the room, a young woman, one of the evening's co-sponsors, rose and slowly clapped twice. Then a few more people followed. Soon the room was applauding, not a thunderous ovation, but one of quiet, resolute recognition. They weren't clapping for Vivian's dinner or her event. They were clapping for Miles. Vivian's fingers dug into her wine glass. Dr. Ling remained standing, speaking casually now with the European. Investors, who were clearly more interested in Miles's talents than any future partnership with her. She heard one of them mutter, "I'd invest in him before I'd invest another dollar here." It landed like a slap. Then came the worst moment of all, a journalist. Vivian spotted her moving through the crowd, press badge out, eyes sharp, a local magazine editor with a reputation for sniffing out scandal in silk-covered boardrooms. She was heading directly toward Dr. Ling. Then she paused, pivoted, and turned toward Vivienne. "Ms. Lancaster," she said, phone recorder already, rolling. "How does it feel to be corrected on a language you used to humiliate a black employee?" Vivian blinked. "Excuse me? I mean, you asked him to translate as a joke, correct? And now it turns out he works with the most advanced language lab in the country. Your thoughts?" "I didn't humiliate him," she said stiffly. "It was banter." "And I had no idea who he was," the journalist raised a brow. "And if he wasn't working for Dr. Ling, would that have made it okay?" That question hit harder than any headline. Vivian stammered, then snapped, "No comment," and turned her back. But it was too late. Eyes had already turned. Phones had already captured it. The story was writing itself in real time. Across the room, Miles returned, no longer carrying a tray. Now he was walking beside a middle-aged black man in a charcoal gray blazer and brown leather shoes. The man had a calm presence, like someone used to watching from the sidelines and waiting for the right moment to move. Dr. Ling noticed them and smiled. "Ah, perfect timing. Everyone meet Professor Solomon Gray, Miles's former linguistics mentor and current director of cross-cultural ethics at Berkeley." The crowd stirred again. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a statement. Professor Gray stepped forward. "Most of you don't know this, but Miles graduated top of his class in linguistics and computer science. He declined 3 Fortune 500 job offers. Why? Because he wanted to understand how people in power talk when they think they're speaking to someone invisible." He turned toward Vivian, his gaze calm but cutting. "Tonight, you gave him your answer." Gasps again. A few heads turned toward the exits, as if realizing too late that their presence might soon be part of a viral video. Vivian just stood there, frozen. No rebuttal, no recovery. And then Miles finally spoke. Not to her, but to the room. "I'm not ashamed to have worn an apron tonight," he said. "Some of the most brilliant people I know were baristas, bellhops, drivers, nurses, janitors. Intelligence isn't proven in boardrooms. It's revealed in how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you." The room erupted, not just applause, agreement, validation, the sound of power shifting. Vivian Lancaster, still dressed like royalty, now looked like someone who'd been unmasked. Not by an expose, not by a scandal, but by a young black man with more fluency in language, in grace, in humanity than she could ever. By the time Miles stepped down from the quiet applause and returned to the edge of the ballroom, the weight of the night had begun to settle. But not on him. It settled on Vivian. She stood there, smiling. On instinct, glass still in hand, nodding politely, but her eyes had lost that gleam of control. The applause wasn't hers. The spotlight had moved. The only thing still clinging to her power was her wardrobe, and even that now looked like a costume. Meanwhile, Miles didn't stay to bask in the aftermath. He slipped quietly behind the curtain separating the main hall from the kitchen, where his apron still hung, folded on a hook. He'd kept it pristine all night, even as champagne spilled and laughter echoed through the corridors of wealth and entitlement. Now he took it down gently, smoothed out the creases, and laid it across a chair. The head chef appeared beside him. "So," the older man said, eyes twinkling behind thick glasses, "you planning on returning to your shift?" Miles chuckled. "Think I just got promoted, Chef." Chef Vargas smiled. "You embarrassed the Queen?" "I didn't mean to," Miles said sincerely. I just didn't like being used. Chef Vargas nodded, as if he'd heard that before, but not in words, in a lifetime of glances and muttered insults behind closed doors. Funny thing about power, he said, people don't really see it until it shifts. Back in the ballroom, guests had begun to cluster around Dr. Ling, Professor Gray, and, surprisingly, each other. Strangers were now exchanging stories about times they had felt invisible, unheard, underestimated. The room was no longer just a fundraiser, it had become a confession box. And Vivian? She stood alone. A few board members had offered weak smiles before slipping away. A major investor had mumbled something about reevaluating timing. The room had moved on without her, and that, more than anything, was what terrified her. She stormed out a side exit, fuming, not crying. Vivian Lancaster didn't cry in public, but vibrating with disbelief. She didn't even realize her assistant had stayed behind. Meanwhile, just as Miles stepped out of the kitchen and prepared to leave, Dr. Ling found him again, this time with his hand extended, not in greeting, but in invitation. How would you like to speak at our global conference in Zurich next month? He asked. Keynote. All expenses covered. Topic. Language is power and the danger of underestimating the fluent. Miles blinked. Seriously? I don't joke about brilliance, Dr. Ling said. Beside him, Professor Gray added with a smile. We've been waiting for the right time. Looks like the world just gave it to us. Miles looked back at the ballroom, then at the folded apron still in his hand. He nodded slowly. I'm in. Vivian Lancaster sat in the sleek glass boardroom of her tech firm, her posture stiff, hands folded tightly in her lap. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, painting harsh lines across the conference table. Across from her sat 5 board members, silent, observing, judging. She'd been summoned for what was called a performance reflection, but she knew what it really was, a reckoning. The story had gone viral overnight. CEO mocks waiter, gets schooled by language genius. It was everywhere, LinkedIn, Twitter, morning shows, but the headlines weren't even the worst part. It was the comments. Thousands of professionals, linguists, veterans of the service industry, and tech workers alike had rallied behind Miles. The man she had treated like background noise had become a symbol, a hero. And she? A cautionary tale. One of the board members, Judith Vance, known for her no-nonsense demeanor, finally broke the silence. Vivian, this firm prides itself on equity and innovation. What you displayed was neither. It was one moment, Vivian replied, her voice low but brittle. One misunderstanding, and he never identified himself. He was posing as staff. That's the point, another board member, Raj Patel, said firmly. You shouldn't need someone's resume to treat them with dignity. Vivian felt the blood rise in her neck, but she forced her face to remain calm. I've built this company from scratch. Are you really going to throw that away over a PR incident? It's not just PR, Judith replied. It's a value breach. And Miles was already working with LinguaCode, one of the most respected AI firms in the world. You mocked one of the most talented multilingual minds of this decade, in public, and then tried to play it off. Vivian leaned forward, her voice sharp. So, what happens now? A pause. Then Judith looked directly at her. We're voting on your temporary suspension from all public-facing roles, and we're launching a third-party cultural review. Vivian's jaw tightened. You're replacing me? No, said Raj. We're holding you accountable. Vivian sat back in her chair, lips pressed together. For the first time in years, she realized she wasn't the loudest voice in the room, and she didn't like the silence that followed. 2 weeks later, the headlines had cooled, but the story hadn't died. It had evolved. Miles's story was now part of a larger conversation. TEDx invited him to speak. Universities reached out for guest lectures. LinkedIn flooded with posts about humility and leadership, many quoting him. And LinguaCode officially listed him as a senior language ethics consultant. His face, once invisible behind trays and linen napkins, now appeared beside phrases like reimagining intelligence in everyday people. Miles, however, had kept his pace calm, almost slow. He turned down interviews that felt performative. He refused to let The world spin him into some shiny commodity. "I'm not a trend," he told Professor Gray. "I'm a person who finally got seen." One day, while preparing for a panel discussion on cultural bias in artificial intelligence, Miles received a message request on his phone. Vivian Lancaster. He stared at the name for a moment, then opened it. "I owe you an apology. Not because the world is watching, because I've been doing some real thinking, and the mirror isn't pretty. If you're open to it, I'd like to talk. No cameras, just person to person." Miles read it twice, then again. He didn't reply. Not because he wanted revenge, but because sometimes silence is the most honest response to people who only learn when consequences arrive at their doorstep. Instead, he focused forward. That evening, he stood at a podium in a community hall, not Zurich, not Stanford, a local youth center in Baltimore. Kids gathered around, curious, unfiltered. One boy raised his hand. "So you speak a bunch of languages?" Miles smiled. "I do. But more important than speaking different languages is listening to people who speak differently." The room was quiet. Then a girl in the back said, "I want to be like you." He looked at her gently and said, "You already are. You just need a world that's finally ready to listen." Vivian Lancaster stood alone in her minimalist penthouse, gazing out at the city skyline, the hum of traffic below, the dull flicker of planes in the distance. It all felt quiet now. Not peaceful, but hollow. She hadn't been to an event since the incident. Her assistant had resigned. Investors now asked questions with a colder tone. The board hadn't stripped her of her CEO title, but she knew the ground had shifted. Power had stopped answering her phone calls the way it used to. On her dining table sat a folder. She opened it again, scanning the report from the cultural audit. Words like elitist language norms, racial microaggressions, blind hierarchies stared back at her. And under recommendations, the top line read, "Consult with professionals like Miles Carter to restructure internal ethics training." She closed the folder. Not out of dismissal, but shame. Across town, Miles was walking through the bustling Lingua Code offices. No apron, no tray, just a notepad and a calm, grounded presence. He'd never sought revenge. He didn't carry bitterness in his tone. What he carried was clarity, a sense that he didn't need to win someone else's seat at the table when he could help build a better table entirely. He'd become more than a translator of words. He translated the temperature of a room, the dignity beneath silence, the cost of dismissiveness. "Hey, Miles," a junior researcher called out. "You good to review the new semantic recognition framework?" "Give me 5 minutes," he replied with a smile. He sat by the window and checked his phone. Another message from Vivienne. "I've stepped down from 2 public boards. I'm listening now." Actually, listening. "If you ever feel like talking, my door's open. This time, I won't ask you to prove anything." He paused, then typed back, "Good. Keep listening." He pressed send and tucked the phone away, because, for Miles, this wasn't about bringing someone to their knees. It was about raising the floor so that no kid who looked like him, talked like him, or came from where he came from would be treated as disposable. As the sun dipped over the city skyline, Miles stood up and walked back toward his team, ready to build not just software, but culture. Vivienne, somewhere in her silence, finally heard the one thing she hadn't the night she mocked him. Respect doesn't have to shout, it just has to stand.